I went through the gender-affirming care system as a minor. My very first medical intervention I ever had was a double mastectomy at 16, and then a few months later, I was put on testosterone, and I realized that this was a mistake. That was not the help I actually needed, and I have since detransitioned to the extent that that is possible.
Keeping our republic is on the line, and it requires patriots with great passion, dedication, and eternal vigilance to preserve our freedoms. Jenny Beth Martin is the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots. She is an author, a filmmaker, and one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world. But the title she is most proud of is mom to her boy-girl twins. She has been at the forefront, fighting to protect America's core principles for more than a decade. Welcome to the Jenny Beth Show.
My boy-girl twins are 20 years old now. The last 2 decades, I've done everything I can to raise my children to be respectful, polite, hardworking, productive Christian members of society who are confident in their own skin. Now they are in college learning where they want to go in life, and I could not be more proud of the adults they are becoming. With the exception of 1 year in middle school, they were in public school from kindergarten to 12th grade. I noticed some alarming trends while they were in the public school system, which I chalked up to anomalies and thought were problems with a few individual people working in the school system. What COVID taught all Americans, most especially parents, is that the issues we were witnessing in our public schools are not one-off anomalies. They are happening in almost every school in the country. The problems are systemic. This is a planned disruption of how kids in America are educated. Plus, our kids are being bombarded about gender ideology or transgenderism or gender dysphoria on social media, in advertisements by major corporations, and in shows and movies that are made for children. The effects on our children are devastating. My next guest is Luka Hein. Luka is a brave young woman who is caught up in all of this. She began transitioning at the age of 16, but now she regrets those decisions and is going through the medical process of detransitioning. Luka is standing up and speaking out against all of this indoctrination because she wants to prevent what she went through from happening to other kids. If you are a parent who is looking for answers on how to talk to your kids about the harmful effects of transgenderism, I hope this episode helps. And if you do find it helpful, please be sure to like the video, subscribe to the podcast, and most importantly, share it with other parents you know so that we get the message out there as far and wide as possible. Well, Luka Hein, thank you so much for joining us today. You are an advocate and have been through really quite an amazing experience in your pretty young life. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about, could we give people some information about what you've gone through? Because you have transitioned and detransitioned.
Yeah, so I am what is known as a detransitioner. I went through the gender-affirming care system as a minor, and was really put down that as like my only path. My very first medical intervention I ever had was a double mastectomy at 16, before hormones or anything like that. And then a few months later, I was put on testosterone, and then I grew up a little bit more, and I realized that this was a mistake. That was not the help I actually needed, and I have since detransitioned to the extent that that is possible, but I will always deal with some form of like health effects from this, most likely.
And you were 16 years old.
Mm-hmm. Yes. What happened when you went into the doctor? Did you go to any kind of therapy before you went to the... I did. So what happened was I was a teenager who had a lot of what are called comorbidities. When it comes to, this kind of medical practice, I suffered from depression, anxiety, ADHD. My home life at the time was kind of rough. I had just changed to a new high school and was having trouble with friends there. Along with that, I was groomed and preyed upon online to the point of authorities actually getting involved in that matter. And it ended up all with me kind of spiraling into this hatred of my body and myself, really. And I came across these spaces online where this kind of almost like these normal, like teenage going through puberty concerns I had, along with everything else going on in my life, was really twisted into, no, you're just born in the wrong body and you are actually meant to be a boy. You know, you hate your breasts not because you're a teenager who has been through some pretty traumatic stuff. It's because you're actually a boy born in the wrong body. And from there, my parents were told about all this while I was in what is called a partial hospitalization program. So it's essentially like a step down from inpatient. It's essentially an intensive therapy program. And they were told about that. They were told, do you want a dead daughter or a living son? And from there, it was affirmation all the way down. I ended up seeing a therapist that specializes in gender diverse youth, is the term that she uses. And it really was just affirmation, and yes, this is what is going on with you. It was never, we're going to get to the bottom of this and see maybe where these feelings are coming from.
And you were in this this therapy program, and I'm presuming that your parents had you in that program or were supportive of you being in that program because they cared about you and they wanted what was best for you.
Yeah, the initial partial hospitalization program was actually for like my other mental health issues at the time. And then when I told the like professionals there, that program specifically wasn't like equipped to handle this kind of thing at the time. But they did go along with like, we're just going to affirm this. This is what's going on. And it really almost seemed like when the gender issues came up, as soon as you like speak those words into existence, everything else going on almost seems to get pushed to the side.
So then any other depression or anxiety or...
It was seen a lot more as, instead of maybe everything else going on in your life maybe causing these ideas of why you feel like you need to escape your body, instead it was, no, we need to affirm your need to escape your body, and then those other issues will go away, which is a very backwards way about how you should go about like working on this issue.
And did you meet any resistance medically from doctors or therapists?
No, not from any professionals.
And you just said something that is rather shocking. And sadly, when we turn on social media, we were hearing more and more about this, but you had a double mastectomy at 16 years old. You couldn't even know possibly what the consequences of that are going to be long-term at 16 years old.
Yeah, I didn't know. I definitely, given my mental health state and also my age, I was definitely not able to fully comprehend like what the the long-term consequences of this would be, as well as really just understand what exactly that surgery meant. Because at least at the time on social media, it was really painted as like this kind of simple, liberating thing that you can get done, instead of it being like, no, you are having a full body part removed. That part was not even in the discussion, it feels like, at the time. It was all very much rephrased in this very positive, almost affirming language.
And then you began testosterone. It's 6 months later, is that what you said?
I got surgery in July, and then November of that same year, I started on testosterone. Did you
have, and then at some point you decide this is not the right thing for you, but in this point, when you're beginning the testosterone, what were the changes that you noticed?
The first one I noticed is your skin texture starts to change, so that starts feeling different. You get acne, your voice starts to drop. Body hair, longer term ones are like fat redistribution. Even like the shape of your face can change a little bit. And when you first start it, of course it feels good because it's a steroid essentially, but also testosterone, it has like natural antidepressant factors. So of course you're going to have this almost like high placebo effect of just like, oh yes, of course this feels good, because that's what it's meant to do essentially, even if it's tearing your body apart.
And was it tearing your body apart?
It was. Now, I took testosterone for 4 years. And around like that last little bit, and especially since I have stopped it, I deal with joint pain, vocal cord pain, atrophy of certain parts of my body, heart issues. Really, really scary stuff to be dealing with, especially like I'm only 21, so it's not fun to think about those things. And it's one of those things where, once again, I was 16, and the idea that I was somehow, capable enough of understanding long-term consequences to sign off on essentially my body's function and my fertility is insane. Like, looking back at it, it is absolutely insane that any medical professional who took an oath to do no harm would look a 16-year-old in the eyes and call something like this care.
I agree 100%. I had to go through fertility treatments to get pregnant, and I have twins, boy-girl twins. When I was 16, I was the oldest of 4 kids. My youngest brother was only like 12 and a half years younger than me. So I'm 16. He would have been 4. And maybe even just 3. I didn't even think I wanted to have children, though, when I was 16, because I'd been helping take care of him since he was born. And I was like, oh, I don't need to be a mom. I was a big sister who helped take care of her brother.
I think it's a very normal thing at 16 to not want kids, and it would be more strange for a 16-year-old to be like, yeah, I want kids now. We'd be like somewhat concerned about that.
Yeah.
But for some reason, if a 16-year-old says they don't want kids ever, we take their word for that, as if you don't mature drastically in those next few years.
In those next few years, and then even from the time I was in my early 20s till my mid and late 20s, much more mature. You're facing a lot more maturity, even over the next decade or so. I guess we are always facing it throughout our whole life. But then when I couldn't have children and had to seek medical help to be able to have children, I have just become this person who is, I'm just always like, you have to look out for fertility. I'm always thinking, you've got to look out for fertility. You don't know what a new drug might be doing. You just pay attention to fertility, because when you're a kid, you don't understand that when you're older, it might be something that you actually really long for. And it infuriates me when I think about what's happening to kids from that perspective, especially just because of what I had to go through medically with fertility treatments. But there's no way as a 16-year-old, even probably as a 20-year-old or an 18-year-old, that you quite understand what you might want a decade later. I mean,
and you say that infuriates you, but I have like another aspect of it that might make you a little bit more mad.
All right, bring it on.
My doctor and I had actually discussed when I was 18 about a hysterectomy. And she made it sound like the simplest thing in the world. It was just the next step in gender-affirming care. She didn't really make it sound like it had any downside. She was even like, oh, you can keep your ovaries in case you do want children. So then maybe you could do some weird form of like IVF with a surrogate and still have biological kids. But that's also just like putting you down another medical pathway that could have been like avoided. But that surgery was actually where my parents absolutely put their foot down and kind of woke up a little bit to the fact that like, this isn't care. They were really, because they know the long-term impacts of what that does to the body. They know that is not a simple surgery. They know what it does to your like pelvic floor structure. And they had that full understanding because of their knowledge in that area that really allowed them to put their foot down. Whereas before they were just essentially trusting the experts, thinking that this had like years of actual scientific backing. And, their biggest crime in all this was trusting a medical industry they thought was going to help. But that was the moment where they were really like, no, that's not care. I have a distinct memory of me like sitting in the other room at the clinic, getting my blood work done or something. and just sitting in the chair. And I remember hearing my dad scream at the doctor, like, lots of kids have mental health issues. That doesn't mean we sterilize them. And, you know, thinking back on that, like, of course, at the time, I was a teenager and, like, and I was embarrassed because I could hear my parents, like, yelling in the other room. But, like, looking back, that's one of the moments that, like, I am so forever grateful.
I am grateful that they did that as well, and that is infuriating. It is really, even as you're older and you're facing a hysterectomy, under normal circumstances, the doctors are telling you these are the pros, these are the cons. We're not just going to give you a hysterectomy just for the heck of it.
Yeah. You're like even medically necessary hysterectomies, they go through almost every other option first before that is the step they take.
Yes.
And the fact that this is essentially being offered up almost to young people is like, okay, well, this is just your next step, is highly concerning. Because even, like, you have women in their, like, 30s that can't get one. They're like, I can't even get their tubes tied sometimes. And they're just like, I'm done having kids, you know, I want this, and they're not getting that. But the fact that doctors will look an 18-year-old in the eyes and be like, yes, this is a simple surgery and we can do it for you is insane.
And what was the reason for it?
It was essentially, well, this is the next step, so then you won't be able to get pregnant. Along with the fact that taking testosterone for long periods of time in the female body can cause atrophy of that area. And so it was essentially just seen as the next step of, like, okay, well, you've done the chest surgery, you've taken hormones. What's next would be hysterectomy and then bottom surgery, which I never intended on going to that last one, but, like, the other one was like a half step, and I believe that was a hysterectomy would have been enough for me to be able to change my birth certificate. And that was the primary justification for it at the time.
Wow. But could you change, say, your driver's license? Yeah. So you didn't really need to change your birth certificate because other legal documents showed what you wanted at that point, or could have shown what you wanted at that point. Okay, so your parents said no there. I'm very glad. I can't imagine being a parent of teenagers, or a teenage, I say plural because I have twins, but in a doctor saying, well, you need to do this because your child might commit suicide if you don't. That's an incredible, just emotionally, psychologically.
It's emotional blackmail. And that is also not how professionals talk about suicide. Those are not the words of a doctor. Those are the words of an activist. Because typically when you follow, like, standard guidelines on suicidality, and this is actually a problem that trans activists have a huge issue of perpetuating, to the point where they are likely causing lots of damage to young people, is, you know, suicidality does have a well-known social contagion factor to it. And the fact that it is not talked about as the most serious thing and is thrown around as a form of essentially emotional blackmail in this conversation is, once again, highly concerning. And those are not the words of a doctor. Those are the words of an activist. And even the activists, if they genuinely cared about preventing suicide, they would not talk about it in the way they do. They would not talk about death in the way they do. They would not, throw around lines like, do you want a dead daughter or a living son? Would you rather be planning a transition or a funeral? Or a more recent one, death before detransition. Wow. And what you are telling young people when you say these things is that instead of it will get better, it may be tough right now, we're going to get you help you need to manage these feelings, because we know how to manage people who are having suicidal ideation. We do all the time. Right. All the time when that happens, for other issues. But for some reason, for this one, plastic surgery is the answer. We know how to manage that. And instead of telling them, it will get better, things are tough, you are implanting the idea in their head that if they do not get a very specific course of affirmation, that is their alternative. And I know this personally because despite the fact that I have never been suicidal, that was never a real risk for me, even back like in my lowest point, dealing with my teenage mental health struggles. That was never a risk for me. And, looking back, understandably, parents are still concerned, even if like I said I'm not at the time. Obviously, mentally ill teenager, you're gonna probably take that with a little grain of salt, but it was never an issue for me. They were still told do you want a dead daughter or a living son? That was still used as emotional blackmail. And hearing that line repeated over and over again from the trans community of essentially, you are at very high risk for suicide if you don't do this, it can really stick in the back of your head of like, okay, well, I don't feel that way right now, but what if I don't go through with this? Then will I feel like that? And it puts such a driver behind that what if that it is almost putting people down a fast track of wanting to get these medical procedures done, because in the back of your mind you have that little like, well, I don't feel suicidal now, but what if tomorrow I feel like because I don't have this, I am going to feel that way. And it is a very dangerous way to have that conversation.
There was a young man who committed suicide who was in my kids' class at school, and afterwards, immediately following that, I did a lot of research on teenage suicide because I'm a parent, and you worry about those things, and I learned through that research just how much of a social contagion it is, and how, I didn't know this before I read about that, but I believe it's the Associated Press has standards for how they, even in headlines, if somebody has committed suicide, how they address it, so they don't flash that in the headline. They kind of bury that much further in the article because they don't want to contribute to it. And then you have doctors sitting there like, here's your alternative, do this. Or
all of the major LGBT organizations as well, if you actually go and find some of their guidelines, when they talk about this stuff, they're like, do not contribute it to one factor, do not imply that legislation will be the cause of it. I could pull them up, but it's essentially the same thing of like, do not oversimplify this. This is a serious issue. Do not contribute it to only legislation. It cannot be traced back to only one source. That is not how this works. And yet, even when the major LGBT organizations are telling you do not talk about it like this in some of their guidelines, you still have activists, you have politicians that will sit there and tell you that you are killing kids, or there is blood on your hands, or this will cause kids to kill themselves, when that is the most irresponsible take that you could ever say out loud, let alone nationally broadcast it. And what you are saying when you talk like that, in my mind at this point, is that you essentially want that to happen. Because if you actually cared about these kids and their mental health, you would not talk like that.
I agree. And based on everything that I've researched about it, any adult should know better. Every one of them should know better.
Abhorrently ignorant or evil when you talk like that. Absolutely. And I pray it's the first, and I fear if it's the latter, frankly.
Death before detransition. That's one of the lines as well.
That is a newer one. And it's not, I've talked about it before, but it's not even necessarily directed at detransitioners. Some of them direct it. I've seen posts where it's like, death before detransition. I didn't say it was going to be my death, which are scary lines.
Yes.
For different reasons than the previous topic, but like that's a scary line by itself. But also, it really is putting young people in this kind of paradigm where they can't leave. You know, even if, let's say, someone has to detransition. Let's say they're a true believer in this still, you know, and they're a true believer. They're part of the community. There's toe in the line. They're still gung-ho. And they have to detransition because of something medically. How do you think that person's going to feel? Like, no matter how small that population is that are still like that, like, how do you think they're going to feel when they have to detransition because of something, or have to stop medical treatment, and they hear you say, it's better off to be dead than to have to detransition. It is highly irresponsible, and it also really is almost cult-like in how you talk about it. Because, you know, a community that was truly about like love and acceptance, they wouldn't tell you you're better off dead than maybe maturing and finding more about yourself and wanting to deal in the game of reality, essentially. And instead you get them saying stuff like that and posting about that. And like I said, it's not necessarily directed at the public detransitioners. It is more so a threat inwards towards the community. Because the public detransitioners we've already essentially left the cult. We're out. They already treat us like apostates would from a religion. They can't do anything about that. But at that point, it is almost a scare tactic to make sure you don't question what's going on. To make sure you stay there and you toe that line. Because to them, they need that. If they cannot maintain that essential internal policing of their own community in that way, it tends to fall apart rather quickly.
You started this at 16, you're 21, and so you must have begun changing medically back, detransitioning fairly recently.
Yeah, I started detransitioning around like September, early October of this past year, so 2022, when I was 20. And that was an entire process of me essentially coming to the conclusion based on like several different things going on that this was something I'm not gonna proceed. I would rather, you know, instead of trying to fight reality and biology at every single turn and the onslaught of that for the rest of my life, I said, you know what? I'm going to deal in reality. I'm going to stop this. And even if it's hard, I would rather face these problems knowing I am standing in reality and I can deal with them rather than essentially continue down that path.
You're public now, but when you began that, I can't imagine that you're like, well, now I'm going to go shout it from the rooftops.
No. Originally, during when I was first detransitioning, there was a little bit of like a hubbub of someone I know made a video, and that was like circulating on specifically like more conservative. I don't know what you want, or commentators.
Right.
Along with some more leftist ones essentially mocking that person. And I remember at the time had made essentially a little video diary for myself. It was different clips I had to cut up, but and it was just me kind of ranting to my phone, sitting in my pajamas in my attic. And it got to the point where I was like, okay, well, you know, I might as well like make a Twitter account and share it. Someone might find it helpful. I expected like 20 people to see it, and then it had like 500,000 views on it the next day when I woke up. So yeah, I didn't expect that to happen.
No, I would imagine not. And I'm sure that when that happened, you were getting it from all sides and every angle in between. When you did that video that went viral, how far along were you in the process of detransitioning? Had you stopped taking testosterone?
I would have essentially I would have just stopped at the time.
Wow. So you're having hormonal and chemical changes while all this viral attention is happening. That's a lot.
Because I remember I filmed it because originally it was just supposed to be for myself. And so I filmed it, and then I didn't post it till like a couple weeks later. But at the time, I would have been like just stopping testosterone. And I remember because I filmed it at home, then I went back up to college when I actually posted it. But
when that part happened, I want to talk about your activism in a minute, but medically You said a few minutes ago that you're having joint pain and your vocal cords, and are you better than you were before? Or how are you doing?
Some things have gotten better. Some things have either stayed the same or gotten worse.
Okay.
Essentially, right after you stop testosterone, when your body's kind of thrown into limbo like that, the closest thing to it is you're essentially throwing your body into a mini menopause at 20 years old. And so during the fall, I had a lot of, like either chills or hot flashes, night sweats, nausea, dizziness, just all of essentially the worst parts of that. And the worst part is I couldn't do much about it because you are essentially stuck in a waiting game of wait and see if things will even like restart and you will get better. I got some blood work done at the time just to see where I was at. But even then it was just that the joint pain has relatively stayed the same. Heart palpitations have gotten almost more like worse essentially over this like spring, just stuff like that. Vocal cord pain depends on how long I talk for, but
the doctor who administered that portion, is it the same one?
No.
Okay. And are there doctors, are there a lot of doctors who are helping with the detransitioning?
Not really. This doctor I went to, she's pretty, she was nice. I'm no longer, I don't think gonna see her just for other reasons from between our conversations we've had where I don't feel comfortable. But she's nice enough, and I essentially went in, I sat down in like the little patient room, and I was very candid. I went through, this is what is going on. I essentially went, this is what I need you to do. Here are the hormones. Like we went through, it was like progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, and my thyroid. Like that's what we needed checked. But she looked at me after I explained everything, and she went, I want to help you, but I have no idea what to do with you. There's no protocol for this, which is frankly kind of terrifying to hear from a medical professional.
But it was honest.
It was honest, and I appreciated it, at least.
Yeah.
But yeah, we did blood work, but aside from that, like I said, it was a wait and see thing. Still is.
I think that the doctors who are working on this part, because I think that it is possible, I don't know, but it's possible that we wind up seeing more people who decide to detransition, given how many have transitioned.
You're already seeing it.
I hope they are connecting and starting to share protocols and communicate. And if they're not, and they're listening to this, they can reach out to me, and I am really good at connecting doctors. I've done that a lot since the beginning of the lockdowns.
A big issue here is that there is no standard of care for detransitioners, and there is also no way to get insurance to cover any of this, which means that if you're someone who needs to maybe go see like 2 or 3 doctors or specialists to get specific things looked at, that is not only going to be hard to find someone who's willing to help you on this issue, because what the detransitioners in general have discovered is there is many medical professionals that are very iffy on if they even want to associate with us in this realm. Not only that, you can't get anything covered, so you're going to probably be paying for it out of pocket. And then you even have states now that where it is mandated that one way be covered, so transitioning is covered, they have explicitly excluded detransitioners from care. Oregon is the one where I believe that got passed into law, and then Texas is one where the Democrats there cheered as they voted down a bill that would have helped both people who had complications from transition and stayed transitioned, and would have helped detransitioners. It is seemingly in the world of certain medical professionals and legislation around standards of care, that detransition is like the word that will just either kill it or needs to be excluded. Which in a realm where you already don't have medical professionals that want to help you, and you're already very essentially isolated in this experience, is once again scary.
Yes, it's very scary. So you had this viral video, and I would imagine that began your activism, or
A little bit. I actually didn't do very much after that video was
because you were
originally
dealing with
released.
night sweats and chills.
I was dealing with all of my health issues. I was also still like actively taking classes at the time, so I was a little more focused on that. Doing those things. And then a few like reporters reached out to me originally. Just as in like, oh, like we can do this via text exchange essentially on Twitter. But aside from that, the first time I actually like flew anywhere to be part of a conversation would have been to New York to go on Chris Cuomo's new show.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because they were doing an investigative piece, and that was one of the first times that like a detransitioner had been brought on to be a part of that conversation.
Did they treat you fairly on that show? That's good.
Mm-hmm. There was everyone was very nice. There was a doctor who is transgender who is actually sitting next to me. She is very, very nice, and really like wants to work through everything with this and make sure people are actually getting care.
That's good.
Everyone was very nice. There was one doctor who is very much pro-transition in every case, who has apparently testified at places in support of letting young children have access to these experimental medical procedures, who I noticed that she would not make eye contact with me, and she couldn't look me in the eyes. And that's when I first started thinking about some of these doctors are essentially having right now an extreme form of cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
Because imagine if you think that you've been doing something that is helping people, and then you have to accept the fact that what you are doing is not supportive by systematic review and is also harming people in the long run. Breaking through that cognitive dissonance there is going to be something that I am convinced that not a lot of people are going to be able to do. And so that is why you see so many people just dig their heels in, because to do anything otherwise would have to essentially be accepting of some pretty dark realities.
I think that you are right about that, and I've noticed this from things that we're grappling with because of COVID, lockdown, some of the medical things that happen with that. It is human nature. It is not to admit that you've made a mistake. So it's really hard to admit that you've made a mistake and accept it and move beyond that. We tend to reject that we've ever made mistakes. And so I think it takes coming to reality, like with the cognitive dissonance, and then also being mature enough to say, okay, I made a mistake. Now how can I learn from it, and what can I do next? Because you can't change history. That doctor, it was a she,
yes.
right? If she did what she did and what she's done, and any of the doctors who are doing this, and they did it because they thought it was the right thing. Okay, and now we found out this is not the right thing, and some of us may have thought, well, I never would have thought it was the right thing, but I can't change what they did in the past. All I can do is try to help fix the future and learn from it.
And that is a sentiment that if some of these doctors are having, like if you're thinking, okay, I want to help fix things, now really would be the time to start like speaking out that you want to help fix things, because the bridge between detransitioners and the medical community is one that is going to be very hard to repair, because a lot of us, myself included here, why would we want to turn back to a medical industry that did this to us? Why should we trust you again? And on the one hand, that makes it understandably maybe a little bit harder to work with detransitioners. But then again, when you have at this point what can be considered like medical trauma, some people are going to have to be up to the task if you want to truly do what your profession is known for and help people.
But they're out there. I don't know who they are, but they are out there. And I'm This conversation with you is making me, I'm going to figure out a way to help connect doctors. If they're willing to, they can reach out to me. My email address is jenny.beth@teapartypatriots.org. And I have connected thousands of doctors since 2020. And I can do that and leave doctors to do the medical discussions, but just keep helping connect them. I'm really good at connecting people.
Another issue on that is some of these doctors, even if they want to help, they are up against what is essentially the affirmative care model, which is something that, even doctors who think this is wrong is essentially like a silencing like tape over their mouth. They can't do that because they will lose their job, they will lose their license if they do not affirm.
And it may be illegal in their state, so they may be facing lawsuits or jail time.
Yeah, which is, we know that let's say like the average pediatrician, we know that most of them want like a systematic review of evidence on this topic, and they are not getting that because of activists who have infiltrated certain levels of, let's say, like the American Pediatrics Association. These big organizations that in reality don't represent, every pediatrician.
Right.
You hear all the time, like every major medical organization in the U.S. supports this. None of them have performed systematic reviews. And also the U.S. is not the only place with major medical organizations. And there is, a certain level of, I suppose, very American hubris to think that we are the center of the world on this when we have so many other countries pulling back from this kind of thing after doing the systematic review. One place in the U.S. that did do a systematic review was Florida. And Florida, despite how much people scream about what's going on down there, went about it in the most professional and like the most scientifically sound way. They got their board of medicine together. They did a very lengthy review of evidence and listened to people from all sides. And they came to the conclusion that there is no evidence for this and it should not be done to kids. And that is essentially what would be like ideally the gold standard when it comes to dealing with this issue. Is you get the medical boards involved. You'd be like, you have them look over all this evidence. And, it just so happens that whenever you have these medical boards looking over evidence, like you have in the UK with the Tavistock, you have in Finland, Sweden, I believe the Netherlands, Norway, even certain organizations in, I believe, France and Australia and maybe Germany that are looking into this more. They come to a conclusion that activists do not like when you actually look at all of the scientific evidence compiled together. Because you can pick out bits and pieces, like you can throw like one-off studies.
Right.
Most of them are done without a control group, have lost a follow-up rate that is so high that they would be considered very, very poor evidence if like usable at all. They're normally short-term. They normally have questionable like standards of how they went about like using questionnaires and things like that. And you can pull these and like throw them and be like, oh, just read the abstract. Look, it supports what I say. And you can throw these one-off studies at people. But it seems to be when you do a comprehensive systematic review of evidence that a different picture emerges. And it is very strange that the activists who will scream, the science is settled about this topic, get very, very quiet when you bring up the systematic review of evidence.
Follow the experts as long as they're saying what I want to hear.
Yeah, that is essentially the vibe is listen to the doctors, listen to the medical professionals until, apparently don't listen to the non-American professionals that have come to the conclusion that this isn't good for kids, all this. I remember having friends who, when they talk about healthcare, all they talk about is, oh my God, we should be more like the Nordic countries with all these things. We should be more like the Nordic countries. We should have like that national health system like they have in the UK. And then on this topic, they get very, very quiet when those systems have done the systematic reviews and come out with, this isn't for kids. And then from there, you also have the question of why is it that in these countries where their health system essentially doesn't make profit, are they coming to the conclusion that we should not do this to kids? And then in the one where it is a large moneymaker to the point where hospital officials have come out and admitted it on video, I believe it was Vanderbilt, where you had a higher up saying like, we can fund entire hospitals on this.
Yeah, I think that you're right. That's where
it is just like, it becomes more and more blatant when you realize just how much money is being made off of this that wasn't happening in those other countries, that allowed them to quickly do a systematic review and get this essentially shut down. Where in the US you have obviously financial incentives to dig your heels in or make the train go full steam ahead.
Right. And if it wasn't Vanderbilt, it was a hospital in Nashville.
There's been multiple at this point.
Right.
I think there's also somewhere in California that you had a doctor saying like, you know, if they regret it, we can just give them breast implants later. There was that video. Yeah.
But your breasts serve a purpose,
yeah.
and an implant is cosmetic.
Yeah. There has been, like I said earlier, is the fact that they don't, at least in the trans community, talk about this, that like, yeah, no, you're losing a whole functional organ.
Right.
They treat it like, oh no, you're just getting like a little bit of fat removed. Like, no, that is a whole functioning organ that you are removing. That is an amputation. And the fact that it is so easily brushed aside by some of these people as, oh, you can just get implants, kind of negates the entire point of the people who have detransitioned and are like suffering with the consequences of this. You know, because I've seen it where it's like, oh, just get implants, just adopt if you're worried about fertility. It's like, just do this other thing. Which misses the point about what we're talking about, is this shouldn't have been allowed to happen in the first place. I will manage how I see fit, but that is not the point of like when I bring up these topics. It isn't, oh, I should just do this. It is, this should not have happened in the first place, and the fact that it did should concern you.
That it should not have happened, and you couldn't buy alcohol until I don't know exactly how old you are, but sometime in the last year you couldn't even buy alcohol.
Let's see. March, 4 months ago.
So until 4 months ago, you couldn't buy alcohol, but they were considering giving you a full hysterectomy, or they'll leave your ovaries in, and a double mastectomy, and major drugs, steroids, hormones that wreak havoc on your body.
It is also crazy because, let's say if a man wanted to walk into a clinic and be like, I want this kind of testosterone because I want to, you know, go to the gym and build muscle, that would be illegal. Like, you can't do that. It's like, I believe it's a Schedule 3 drug. It's on the list somewhere. But you wouldn't be able to do that, and yet we are giving it to teenage girls, and just completely ignoring the effects. Like, some of the explanations for the effects I've been having, I had to go get from female bodybuilders, like forums for them, where they are talking about where they did like a course of steroids, essentially. So not long term, constantly, like I was on, but even just like a course or two of steroids, and them talking about the issues they face. Like, we know what this does to the female body, and we have seemingly forgotten that on this topic.
Or we are ignoring it.
Willfully ignoring it in the sake of, oh, it's fine because the magical gender identity, like, mythos told us that this is okay and won't have that same effect.
So we want to stop this from happening to kids. And I saw, the way that I wound up learning about who you are is I saw a video of you. I think it was outside of the California legislature, or maybe the Texas. I don't I think
It
it
would
was
have been it would have been California.
And you were giving a speech,
Yeah,
like at a
Sacramento.
protest or a demonstration.
Yes.
And that's how I just was so moved. I think I reached out to you immediately and just said, I'd love to be able to interview you. So what are you working with an organization? Is there a group?
I've worked with a few different, like, just groups that are, concerned about this. One is a parent group called Partners for Ethical Care.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked with some of their members before. They're the sweetest people in the world. They're all like moms and dads who have had experiences essentially in this realm going one way or another, ending positively or negatively, but they have been very supportive, and I'm very lucky to have met the people from there. I've also worked with an organization called Do No Harm, who focuses more on the medical side of things.
I want to make sure people know that these are organizations that are worthy of support.
Mm-hmm. There are, in terms of like just general talking about like detransition in healthcare, there is an organization called GenSpec that I haven't personally looked into it, but I believe they help connect detransitioners to like counselors, or like they also provide resources. I know that. I've scrolled through that page before on like, okay, you've taken this step, now what? But yeah, those are, I would say, the main three that I can think of off the top of my head.
And you've spoken before elected officials now, right? And
yes,
school boards, legislatures?
Mainly just legislatures. I've spoken in Wyoming, Nebraska, Missouri, Kentucky, and Indiana. And when I go there, I essentially share my story, what happened, and how I think that, it's time for the adults in the room to stand up, because those who took an oath to do no harm have failed, is one of the lines I've used in it before. Gonna be real, most stressful experiences of my entire life. Nothing is topping going and doing that. I actually had to stop because my heart issues were getting worse, like recently, and I was like, okay, we need to cut back because my heart issues were getting worse, and that much stress on my heart was definitely not good. Right. Okay. In terms of like dealing with that.
I mean, you're 21 years old. This is it's hard for adults to do this, so that's a lot for you.
Yeah, it's been quite the change, especially because historically speaking, I was someone who couldn't even give a presentation in front of my high school English class without feeling like I was going to pass out, to the point where I had to just give it to the teacher after class. Like, it was that bad. And then, I think in this particular case, I found something that is worth getting over that for. It's worth me being anxious and kind of getting over my fear of public speaking if it means it's actually going to help.
You're going to help people. It may take a while, but you, and I've never met Chloe, but I've seen her online, and I know there are a couple others who I've seen you guys with. You guys are going to make a difference. And it's okay to take a step back and go, I can't do this right now.
And some of us are.
And that's okay.
And it also, some of us are doing it for that. It's also like legislative sessions have also recently, or oftentimes coming to a close this time of year too. So yes, you have that. So it's almost like we all get like somewhat of a little break from things. But I work during the summer, so after I'm done here, I'm good to go straight back to that. But it's one of those things where we have all become, I suppose, rather good at being like, okay, here are our boundaries now. We're going to set this and take the time we need to heal if need be, because of the fact that, not only is this a like high stress, high heat issue at the moment, but also because most of us are suffering with some sort of health consequence. And what led you in, at least from your story, I don't know theirs, but from what you've said, led you into transitioning in the first place. There were mental and emotional
trauma that you were dealing with. So you've got to make sure that you've learned, in those boundaries are important,
Yeah.
so that you don't, that's part of how you learn how to deal with those kind of issues.
Yeah, no. One of the biggest things I have learned in, let's say, like the past 8 months was just how to say no and mean it, and realize that me saying no has value in me putting up that boundary. And I have essentially phrased it before as I finally like grew a spine and some teeth and learned to not be afraid to bite back a little bit and like stand up, which is something that I was, at least in my opinion, sorely lacking throughout, some of my teenage years. So
and that's understandable. A lot of teenagers are in that position, and most don't have, they're not going through as much as what you went through.
Yeah.
So affirming care, that is a real problem.
Yes.
Let's explain that just a little bit more. Like, I asked you, did you have any resistance? And you said no. But what kind of laws are being passed that are, what does affirming care mean, and how serious of a problem is that?
The affirmation model essentially means that if someone comes in and they say that they are transgender, or they think they have gender dysphoria and they want to transition, you have to essentially take that as at face value and believe them. So even if you know that this person has multiple comorbidities, or just had maybe something traumatic happen to them, you cannot suggest that that is the possible cause of these new feelings. You cannot work to the root to see where this gender dysphoria might be coming from. You have to take it on face value and essentially say yes. You cannot push back. You cannot question that aspect of their quote-unquote identity. You just have to go with it. And any pushback against it is, in some places, seen as conversion therapy. Despite the fact that many of the detransitioners have talked about, myself included, have talked about how our feelings of gender dysphoria have almost come out of a sense of trauma. A lot of us have what would be considered like the list of comorbidities, and some of those are the main ones that I see is like personality disorders like BPD, ADHD, depression, anxiety, autism. Undiagnosed autism is a big one among people who are both transitioning and detransitioning, particularly in this younger group now. Childhood sexual assault or some sort of traumatic sexual experience is another one that is sadly common, to the point where it makes you realize that we are truly failing, particularly the young women who were not given help that they needed in that, and felt the need to escape their body.
And it's not even young women. I mean, we're talking about kids.
Yeah,
and
kids.
Teenagers.
Teenagers.
We're failing our kids.
I guess I phrase it like that in the term that you have when they grow up and they realize, I was not.
Right.
Which is very, very sad that was not helped, and they weren't protected and, kind of loved through that in a way that they needed. But you have like all these comorbidities, and under affirming care, to even suggest that maybe we need to get to, the source of this, or like maybe we need to work through these other issues first because they're almost more pressing in some cases. Or maybe, we should screen for things like autism. That is not happening. And oftentimes these behaviors or comorbidities are seen as something that if you get put through gender affirming care, it will fix those things. Whereas in reality, at least I believe it should be viewed as the other way around. Whereas we're gonna make sure you are essentially, the most stable, the most mentally well you can be. We're gonna screen for all this other stuff, because there's a likelihood that if you do that, you're gonna prevent people, from detransition. If you do like legitimate care and give people like actual mental health care, screen for the things that we know are comorbidities, work through these things, really question and push back, and like get to the bottom of these feelings, you would have less detransitioners in the start. I don't think this is appropriate for kids at all, but if they did that, you would have less of us.
And I think in California, the model now is affirmative care.
You
only.
you cannot. There are several states now, I believe, that have
Oregon.
put it into place where you cannot do anything other than the affirmation model. And when you really think about it, the affirmation model isn't, specifically in terms of therapy, that's not therapy. Like, only telling someone yes like that and affirming what they're saying isn't therapy. You know, you're supposed to like actually work through things in therapy. And on this issue, for some reason, it's only, yes, you are correct in how you are essentially viewing the world. And instead of trying to do what would be typically the case of if the body and mind are unaligned like that, aligning, changing, like working on the mind to realign it with the reality of the body, instead, they take it to the extreme of, okay, no, we're going to immediately change your body. Which, for a mental health issue, is an insane deviation from how things have done, to the point where the last time we had a drastic physical intervention like that for a mental health problem would have been like lobotomies.
Yes.
And I have, you know, there's been some people I know who have referred to, essentially referred to these surgeries as like, I can't remember if it was like a gender lobotomy or a sexual lobotomy, one of those two.
That's a good comparison.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a sad comparison.
It's an extremely sad comparison. I believe that was Richie who made that comparison. But it's very sad when you come to that realization. Because, you know, there are other mental health issues that essentially manifest themselves in not viewing your body in reality. You know, like dysmorphia, anorexia, essentially any eating disorder for that matter. And you know, you don't give an anorexic girl liposuction. I know one of the other detransitioners who was struggling with both, and you know, she went and asked for liposuction, and they didn't give that to her, but they gave her a double mastectomy. And I think when she first said that in a testimony, I like my like jaw almost hit the floor, and I almost started crying for her.
Yes. I'm kind of reacting that way right now.
Yeah, just because the fact that you can see that there are two almost very similar things going on in a lot of these young people now being put through this system, and you would affirm one but actually treat the other. You would think that would be enough of like a double think to make someone snap out of it.
Affirmative care, I saw polling, and I think the Washington Post recently, that said that people don't think that kids should be transitioning, but they think that affirmative care is good. And
they do not know what it means.
They don't know what it means. It just affirming sounds...
We need to start calling it what it is. It is not affirmative care. It is sex changes for children. It is not real therapy. You are not getting to the root of issues. You are affirming someone who is having a problem. And instead of helping them through that problem, you are saying, no, you are correct in how you are viewing the world through the lens of that problem. And then this leads to the path of, okay, you're like sterilization, surgery, just everything like that. And it's we know for gender dysphoria, we know if you just leave kids alone, if you do not affirm them, you just leave them alone and let them grow up, yeah, they're going to struggle. Some of them are going to struggle. But you can help them through that. And we know that upwards of, like, I believe it's like upwards of 80, 88%, 90% grow out of these feelings of gender dysphoria. And so the fact that the jump now is to immediately medicalize, essentially, especially when there's very, very young kids, to almost immediately be like, no, this kid is actually trans. And instead of letting them grow up, going through puberty is the biggest cure for gender dysphoria, essentially, when your brain kind of balances out once it gets all those hormones. You know, if there was any other condition that simply waiting it out and growing up had like a 90% success rate in fixing it, we would be hailing that as like, oh my God, this is great. we can actually help these people, and we don't have to do anything invasive. We can, just things like that. And for some reason on this one, we've now gotten to the point where we are going to stick children on puberty blockers before they even get that chance to grow out of it.
We don't want to eat meat with hormones in it, but we're putting hormones in the kids.
Yeah. It's all vague, not even vaguely, it's just straight up unhinged. And also when you look at it specifically with the really, this is what breaks my heart, with the really little kids, it is all based, even with older people, it is all based on the most twisted regressive 1950s stereotypes of what it means to be a man or a woman. Because you see these videos of like, oh, well, my son, likes to wear his sister's tutu, or play with Barbies, or likes glitter and likes to like put on mom's makeup or something like that. And before this child can even really comprehend what it means to be a person, like a lot of these kids are at the age where they are still very like egocentric, like they're focused on themselves. They don't even really comprehend that other people maybe have feelings and they can interact in that way, because that's just how child development works. You have the parents already being like, no, my child actually told me that they were trans at like 3 or 4 years old. And my only response to that is, a transgender 5-year-old is like a vegan cat. We know who made the decision. It wasn't the cat in that situation. It's to the point where it's gotten its own like nickname almost in these circles, where it's called Transhausen by proxy, as a play on Munchausen's by proxy. Because like I said, you see these, like the concept that tomboy is essentially dead in these spheres, or the concept of just a boy who likes to maybe play with Barbies or put on, like princess dresses, is a sign that means that kid is actually trans. And one of the scary parts is when you listen to particularly older gays and lesbians talk about their childhood, or even just tomboys, or some straight men as well. When you listen to these people who are older talk about their childhood, they're like, yeah, I would have been put down this path today if this had been like the cultural zeitgeist when I was going on. They're like, yeah, I was a tomboy. Or you have gay men being like, yeah, I loved makeup and princess dresses. And it really is a very, very regressive movement when you look at it like that. Some people have used the phrase transing the gay away, because when I previously mentioned that giant significant portion of kids that grow out of these issues, a good chunk of them are going to grow up to be gay or lesbian. And we are making kids permanent medical patients before they even have a concept of who they are, of what it means to be like your body, essentially. And we're not even giving them that chance in this medical system right now. And that is what needs to be stopped.
Absolutely. A couple more things, and then you're from Nebraska.
Yes.
So when people think this is only happening like in California and Washington and Oregon, but it's not. It's everywhere.
Not. It's happening in every state, essentially, in the country.
The lady who recently came out, and I guess we could consider her a whistleblower at a hospital. She was
Jamie Reed.
She's from Missouri,
yes,
right?
She's from Missouri.
Yeah, that's... This is the heartland of the country. It is not just on the coast. It's not just in San Francisco and Seattle and Portland and New York. It's happening everywhere. And it's important that the audience understands that. And one of the things that my team and I have decided is that we keep seeing everything on I suppose a lot of it is who I'm following on Instagram, but every time I open Instagram, I can't scroll very long before I'm seeing something that's the equivalent of libs of TikTok, whether it's libs of TikTok or not, just showing something that is horrible and awful that is happening to kids related to transitioning. And I don't mind seeing it. I think that it's important to be aware. I don't want to normalize it, because both sides are just glorifying it for clicks. And I want to make sure that I'm figuring out how can I help? And what can I do to empower other people who want to help? The medical community and making sure that they are doing what they should be is the most important. And you're 21 and you may not have an answer for this, and it's okay if you don't. If you do, though, I think it'd be helpful just to know, what would have been things that maybe your parents could have said, or that parents can say to kids if they're coming to them talking in these terms about transitioning potentially?
If you can, don't let your kids on social media. Just straight up don't. Because a lot of this starts with essentially like getting pulled down rabbit holes on social media or having like unfettered internet access. If you're going to let your kids have social media, monitor them and make sure you know what content they are consuming. Another big thing is really keeping not only an open line of communication with your children, but really making sure that relationship is there and it's a like loving, supportive relationship, and that they have you as that adult to talk to, so that way no other we're gonna say more predatory adult can kind of weasel their way in there. Because I know that was something at the time. My parents were just going through a divorce and I felt rather alone, and like I didn't have anyone. And not to mention you have the entirety of the trans community essentially saying that your parents are going to hate you, which to a vulnerable young person is a terrifying thought.
Even if they're teenagers and they're angry at their parents, everyone wants to be loved by their parents. You still don't want,
them to have that reaction. But it is essentially like for parents, the biggest thing is really keeping that communication. And then if that comes up, acting on it with love in a very firm way. And that is one thing that this movement has really corrupted, because it is not love to only say yes to someone and affirm them. That's not love. That's enabling. If you actually love someone, you're going to have to put up those boundaries, even if it's going to make them mad. And this is one of those cases. You hear stories about parents who, when their kids started essentially dealing with these issues, they phone went away, different school, moved some of them. Because you do have the issue now of essentially it spreading around, particularly teenage girlfriend groups, where they're going to these clinics together, essentially. Just like every other historical social contagion that teenage girls fall prey to. I think the older generation might remember that there was probably a group of girls in your high school that were like binging and purging together or had anorexia. Yes. I know I asked my mom about that, and she's like, yeah, I remember that. And they've just been like, okay, we're going to give you all the love and care you need. I've heard stories of moms who essentially quit their job, switched to homeschool, and just took their kid traveling. And we're like, I'm going to give you actual support, and we're going to work through this together, and we are going to really build that strong relationship as a family, and I'm going to put those boundaries up so you can like relax and finally feel better. I can't remember who told me this, but there was a parent I was talking to that was telling me the story of essentially a daughter came home and was dealing with these issues, and the mom just went, hey, we're going to figure this out. You are okay. We're going to work through this, and we're going to work through this essentially in a way that's going to actually help you. And by putting those boundaries up, she said that the girl just like relaxed, because kids need boundaries. They do. That's part of childhood development. The boundaries change on age, but kids need boundaries, and they need ways to healthily push against those boundaries. It's a joke that like teenagers like to rebel, but it is actually like developmentally important that they have boundaries that they can safely push against to kind of explore themselves and really develop. And it is concerning to me that we have begun to take away those boundaries. And in this case, like as a society, we have removed some of those boundaries. But in this case, we have also replaced those boundaries, like the gap where that boundary was, of just teens doing, like, in hindsight, kind of cringy stuff and pushing back against society, we have not only taken away that healthy boundary, but we have replaced that gap where it once was with an experimental medical industry, which in some ways is worse than if the boundary just didn't exist at all.
That's a scary, it's a scary comparison.
Because kids need that when they develop, and not having that at all ages is going to lead to problems. You know, there's a reason we don't let kids essentially decide their own bedtime or eat whatever they want. And they may throw a fit about it. And, you know, sometimes you got to let the toddler throw their tantrum, but staying firm on that boundary is how you grow, like, healthy, functional adults. You know, back in, like, the 2000s, dyeing your hair a weird color, like, and putting on black makeup and wearing the, like, rubber bands all over your arms with a band t-shirt and listening to what is seen as, like, alternative music, that would have been pushing against those boundaries. But I don't think any parent went out and legally changed their kid's name to, like, Ebony Darkness Master of the Ravens or something, like some of the names that you see teenagers picking from that time period. We don't see a lot of, like, 30-year-olds still in that paradigm because they were allowed to have the rebellion. Teenagers, just developmentally, they will need that. Like, I know parents really want to be like, no, my teen is never gonna push back against these things. I raised them so well. But to a certain extent, teenagers need, like I said, the healthy boundary to push against to see, like, they are developing into their own person at that age. And once again, it is very scary that we have not only taken that boundary away, but replaced it with something that's going to result in sterilization, lifelong health impacts that these kids cannot consent to because their brain isn't fully developed. Like, their sense of identity is not fully developed at the time that most of these kids are getting these treatments, which is very worrying.
Is there anything else that you would want to say in this episode today? And at some point we may revisit and do another episode, but for today.
I guess specifically, one thing I always bring up is that, you know, you see all the legislation going around right now, and it is very easy to get, like, caught up in the media whirlwind of it. But at the base, I have never met any of these politicians I've talked to, any of these, you know, these representatives or the parents supporting this, or, you know, none of this is coming from a place of hate. It never is. It's coming from a place of wanting to protect kids and protecting that, like, the magic and the innocence that a child experiences in the world should be essentially the top goal of a healthy society. You know, making sure kids are safe and can thrive and grow up in a healthy society should be top priority. And it's sad that we're to the point where we're having to have these conversations. It is sad that, you know, legislation has to get involved, you know, because in my ideal world, legislators wouldn't have to do this because the medical community would have gotten it together enough to actually hold themselves accountable. And it got to the point where they had their chance to do so, and they dug their heels in at every turn. You know, it's not coming from a place of hate. It's about protecting kids. And I know it may seem exhausting seeing this topic come up consistently, but please, for the future generations, try not to let yourself get worn out or apathetic about it. Because that is my main concern that I see people right now coming up with, well, why should I care? You should care because without a safe and protected future generation, it's not going to end well for any of us when these kids grow up. So
we have to protect our kids. And this is the hill to die on if we have to die on it. This is wrong. What's happening to the kids right now? what happened to you was wrong.
Of any hill to die on, protecting, children's innocence, protecting their future life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, really, is the hill to die on, if there is one. If any. This is the one to do it with.
Well, I'm going to climb the hill with you. So and I think that there are a lot of people across the country right now who want to know what they can do to help. And Tea Party Patriots Action, we're working on assembling the tools and resources so we can help the everyday grassroots activist to be able to engage in this. And it will turn into a left-right, Republican, Democrat type issue, but it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be.
I've met, in the media it's getting stereotyped as, these are Republican lawmakers. There are, particularly like voter-wise, and like the parents I've met, I feel like the majority of like the moms in some of these groups I've talked with, they're all Democrats. It shouldn't be a left-right issue. Mm-mm. And do not let them turn it into a left-right issue, because the minute protecting kids becomes a left-right issue, it is a very worrying level of polarization at that point, because it shouldn't be. Like I said, protecting kids in a healthy society is everyone's duty.
That is right. And that Washington Post poll that I referenced a few minutes ago, the good thing is that the majority of the country thinks that this is wrong to do to kids. Mm-hmm. And so I don't know what the political affiliation on that was, but I know that neither party has a huge majority, that we're a pretty sharply divided country. So it isn't just about sports, which are very important, and protecting womanhood is important, but also just protecting kids. So we're not allowing doctors to do these things they shouldn't be. Extremely important. Luka Hein, thank you so much for being with us today. And we will continue to look for ways to help engage people and to make sure that we are advocating to protect kids when it comes to this kind of surgery and these kind of medical procedures. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Jenny Beth Show is hosted by Jenny Beth Martin, produced by Kevin Mooneyhan, and directed by Luke Livingston. The Jenny Beth Show is a production of Tea Party Patriots Action. For more information, visit teapartypatriots.org.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to stop freedom thieves from turning our country into a communist nightmare, be sure to click the thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And while you're at it, click the notifications bell to get an alert every time we post a new episode.